One day, a chicken and a pig were walking through town when they ran across some very poor children. Overcome with compassion for the poor children, the chicken said to the pig, "I think we should give these children ham and eggs to eat." But the pig said, "That's easy for you to say. For you, that means a little sacrifice. But for me, that means total commitment." I guess that sums up what I've been trying to convey through the course of these videos, and what I believe God wants from all of us: total commitment. At least to practicing the principles we've been discussing, and in fact, making them a daily practice. Practice, when used as a verb, according to the dictionary definition, means to do something again and again in order to become better at it. I would practice an instrument to become really good at it, for example. When used as a noun, practice is the continuous exercise of something, such as a profession, like a legal or medical practice. My husband is a professional violinist, and before a performance, he practices constantly so that when he performs, he doesn't have to think about it. It comes naturally. His fingers just fall into place without effort. And those who are engaged in professional practices, such as doctors or lawyers, have reached a point where their capability can be trusted by those who need their help. The goal of practicing perfection during this study is twofold as well, such as the definitions I just gave you. Number one, I believe the Lord wants me to practice His principles, particularly His love and His kind of forgiveness, etc., so much that I don't even have to think about them anymore. My flesh falls right into line with His will. Like my husband's fingers fall right onto the fingerboard of his violin. It's not painful anymore, or not as painful anymore, to give up my rights or to forgive and love someone who has hurt me. And the other side of that kind of practice is that I want God to be able to trust me to do the right thing in a given situation. Oh yes, God doesn't just want me to trust Him. He wants me to be trustworthy too. Like when my kids were small, for instance. I really needed to know that I could trust them to behave in public. How your children behave in public can say a lot about what goes on behind the scenes at home, you know. In my home, we disciplined our children and taught them right and wrong so that when we were in public places, I knew that they were aware of how to behave. And my trust for them grew as they proved over and over that they could be trusted. Of course, there were times when they acted up, and I didn't stop loving them when they did. And they didn't go back to square one either. But I did discipline them until they learned that it wasn't right to behave that way. Through years of practice, my sons became polite young men, and today I don't have to monitor their behavior anymore. Thankfully, because they're in their 30s. God calls Himself our Father as a message to us that how loving parents rightfully regard their children is really how He regards us. He sees our weaknesses, and He doesn't love us any less because of them, but He does have expectations like any good father would. He wants the very best for us and will do anything for us to have that. But we have to live in cooperation with His will and be totally committed to Him. It's been said about the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament that they're not 10 suggestions. Let's look at a passage in Matthew 22, where an expert in the law of God, or the commandments, asked Jesus a question, hoping to trip Him up. They were always trying to do that. But this is how Jesus summed up the commandments, starting in verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. One of them, a lawyer, asked Him a question, testing Him. "Teacher, which is the great commandment of the law?" And He, Jesus, said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." Jesus is basically saying here for knuckleheads like me, not to stress so much about keeping all the commandments, because these two commandments cover all the commandments if we keep them. So if you want to be like Jesus, just love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, the three most important components of a human being, and love your neighbor, who is everyone else besides you, as much as you love yourself. Now, please take note that Jesus didn't say to love your neighbor more than you love yourself. In fact, when we make the mistake of loving others more than ourselves, we sometimes enable them to hurt us. Jesus was assuming here that if you love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, that you would have a proper regard for yourself, who is made in God's own image. However, if you don't love yourself, you don't love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, and you can't love your neighbor as you should. Actually, if you love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, I don't think you even need to be told to love your neighbor, because loving my neighbor is an automatic response to loving God. When I was 12 years old, I lived right next door to an evangelical church. One year, some children came from Wichita Falls, Texas, and invited me to Vacation Bible School. They poured out the love of God to that lost little girl, their neighbor, in such a way that at the end of the week, I gave my life to Jesus. I wanted more of what they had. Unfortunately, the children left to go back home, and no one at the church followed up, and my salvation experience soon faded away. You see, a baby Christian needs other, more mature Christians, like we talked about last week, to guide the baby until she can walk. But no one did. Now, I've talked a lot about all the things I did to myself and that I let others do to me. Well, those things happened because I didn't love myself at all. That's the core reason why I let others take advantage of me. I didn't love God's creation, His child, me. Gratefully, even though I strayed very far away from God, He didn't stray from me. And I forgot the promise I made to Him, but He never forgot the promise He made to me and to all of His followers from Hebrews 13:5. He said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever abandon you. The point I'm trying to make with all of this is that love is what we're called to practice above all else. You see, all those years, 17 years that I walked away from God, even though I wasn't living like anything resembling a child of God, He still loved me. And I knew that if I ever died, I would go home to be with Him. Despite how I was living, I don't even know how I knew, but I did know. That's how I knew my brother went to heaven. He died of a heroin overdose on the street, like we talked about earlier. But as I also told you earlier, he gave himself to Jesus before he died, and God made sure he was safe. There's something very important that you need to understand. We can't do anything to gain our own salvation. Nothing. Jesus paid it all, as the song says. And I don't believe that we can do anything to lose our salvation either. Nothing. Now, I do believe that some have renounced their faith in Jesus or given His gift back to Him, and maybe some were never saved. But He will never take His gift back. Of that you can be sure. As we studied last week, faith without works is dead. So, God will ask you to grow up at some point and start acting like the child of God you are. He was so patient with me. He was and is so kind and understanding. Just like 1 Corinthians 13 says, and I want to read the whole chapter if you want to turn there with me. It is called the love chapter, and it has 13 very important verses. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. But if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I also have been fully known. But now faith, hope, love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. 1 John 4:16 says that God is love. So naturally, the greatest of everything that we should know or practice is love. I just want to interject here that love doesn't mean letting someone else hurt you in the name of love. Love does discipline. We discipline our children, and God disciplines those He loves. But love is not cruel. And love definitely sets boundaries around the heart of that child of God you are called to love and protect, who is you. Practice makes perfect. And remember that perfect that we talked about last week and this week only means complete or mature through a process. So love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then practice loving others. And with that comes forgiveness, another thing I need to practice all the time. And don't worry about assignments. If you're not loving or forgiving the way you ought to, God will give you assignments. You know, I use my brother Wayne's life story sometimes, but please don't think I do it to bash him. I love my brother and am anxious to see him again. He was kind and gentle and a generous person, the kind the devil loves to cripple at a young age. And when I use his story or that of my father, who have both gone to be with the Lord, it's only because I know that they would want their stories to minister to others. For instance, when my dear brother Wayne was alive, he stole things to support his habit. Back in my 20s, I loved expensive jewelry and had collected quite a bit of it. Well, little by little, I started losing a ring or a bracelet or a necklace or something else of value that I owned. I suspected my brother, but I couldn't really blame him because I hadn't seen him do it. Then once I was at a mutual friend's house, a drug dealer actually, and he told me that my brother had sold him my antique emerald and diamond ring worth thousands of dollars for $40. I could hardly believe it, even though my brother had been in prison several times for robbery, that he would do such a thing to me. The bottom line is that God used my brother to help me practice true love. Wayne taught me that things are not what hold true value. The love I had for my brother far outweighed all that he'd ever taken, even though at the time I was just really mad. But things can be replaced. People can't. Not here anyway. And God also used my brother to help me practice forgiveness. Wayne didn't stop stealing from me, but it actually became easier and easier to forgive him, even though I did eventually have to set up boundaries so he couldn't hurt me or steal from me anymore. That wasn't fair to him or me. The most important thing I leave with you from the past 2 weeks is to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind. As Jesus said, all the other commandments depend on those being applied to our lives. And yes, it does take practice and total commitment to make time to be with the Lord and to prioritize what He prioritizes. Remember, you can't really love someone you don't really know. And you can't know someone unless you spend time with them. So spend time with them. And thank you for spending time here with me and with Him today. See you next time.